Chapter 2, The Myth of Growth, Limits, and Sustainability. Begins with a quote from J. Forrester. Exponential growth does not continue forever. Growth of population and industrialization will stop. If man does not take conscious action to limit population and capital investment, the forces inherent in the natural and social systems will rise high enough to limit growth. The question is only a matter of when and how growth will cease, not whether it will cease. Carrying capacity and limits to growth. On May 11th, 1943, American forces stormed Attu, the island that anchors the western end of Alaska's Aleutian archipelago. At the time, Attu was held by more than 2,400 Japanese troops. The next 18 days witnessed one of the toughest battles in the Pacific Campaign of World War II. By May 29th, only 28 Japanese soldiers remained alive, out of 2,400. The cost in American casualties was heavy as well, with 71 men being killed or injured for every 100 Japanese. Only the battle for Iwo Jima resulted in proportionally higher losses for the Americans. By August 24, 1943, the Japanese had been forced out of all the Aleutian Islands. But as part of the war's development plans, against future Japanese activity in the region, the U.S. Coast Guard put a LORAN, L-O-R-A-N, that's long-range aid to navigation, station on St. Matthew's Island to the north of the Aleutians. St. Matthew, an isolated island in the middle of the Bering Sea, was manned by a contingent of 19 men. As a means to supply fresh meat to the operators of the station, the Coast Guard introduced 29 reindeer to the island on August 1944. With the surrender of the Japanese the following year, the St. Matthew station was closed. The reindeer herd was forgotten. 12 years later, U.S. Fish and Wildlife biologist David Klein was sent out to St. Matthew to see what had become of the reindeer. With the help of associates, he inventoried the entire 130-square-mile island and counted 1,350 healthy animals, a 47-fold increase in the size of the herd in little more than a decade. The reindeer's dramatic population growth was the result of two things: good habitat in the form of dense stands of reindeer lichen, a staple for this species, and a lack of any predators. Klein's next visit to the island occurred in 1963. Although the population growth had slowed during this interval, Klein now counted 6,000 animals. This time, the reindeer were noticeably malnourished, having lost an average of 40% of their body weight since his last visit. Their forage and reindeer lichen had dramatically degraded. The following winter was harsh, even by regional standards, but Klein wasn't able to return until the summer of 1966. That summer, he found the reindeer population had suffered a precipitous decline. Skeletal remains were everywhere, and his inventory found only 42 remaining animals, all females, with the exception of one deformed male. By this point, the herd was no longer able to reproduce, and the entire reindeer population became extinct somewhere in the 1980s. The St. Matthew reindeer herd is a potent example of what can happen to a population that exceeds its carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is an ecological concept that is defined as the maximal population size that an ecosystem can support without being degraded in some fashion, indefinitely. Once a population of organisms overshoots its carrying capacity, the ecosystem that supports the population becomes impaired, which in turn has negative consequences for the population that has grown too large. What results is a precipitous population decline. The St. Matthew herd is an unusual example since it is very rare for even a dramatic population die-off brought on by overshoot to result in extinction. The catastrophic reduction in reindeer's food supply caused by overgrazing resulted in the degradation of the population's ecosystem. With so many animals entering the winter of 1964 in a malnourished condition, only a handful were able to survive. In this way, the limited forage generated negative feedback within the ecosystem, and negative feedback led to the eventual demise of the reindeer. Every population of organisms in every ecosystem on this planet has a carrying capacity. Let me say that again. Every population of organisms in every ecosystem on the planet has a carrying capacity. If they exceed it, their system will be degraded, creating negative feedback that will eventually cause a decline in the organism's population size. In this way, the carrying capacity sets the limits to growth for all populations. Another Arctic species that regularly taunts limits to growth is the lemming, whose populations exceed their carrying capacity roughly every 4 years. Some of you have probably heard of lemmings throwing themselves from cliffs when their population growth has reached its zenith. The notion that lemmings kill themselves in such a fashion is actually a cultural myth that was birthed by less than a minute of footage from one of Walt Disney's early nature documentaries, The Living Arctic. When lemmings exceed their carrying capacity, both a lack of suitable forage and an increase in stress due to frequent encounters with members of their own species eventually cause individuals to leave their territories in an effort to seek less populated locales. Lemmings migrating randomly across the landscape displace ever more lemmings from their territories. In their agitated migratory state, they suffer high mortality rates from increased predation and malnourishment brought on by reduced forage. But Walt Disney knew that random migration and the death of lemmings would not serve as very dramatic footage. As a means to add drama to the living Arctic, he orchestrated a more memorable ending for the lemmings. His crew gathered up hundreds of these animals and transported them to an oceanside cliff. With the cameras running, the crew released the lemmings and stampeded them to the cliff. To this day, most Americans familiar with lemmings believe that somewhere out there exists Lemming Cliff, where the animals regularly hurl themselves into the sea. Although lemmings do suffer dramatic population declines following overshoot, intentional suicide is not one of the reasons for the decline. When I was in high school, I witnessed the impacts of another example of a population exceeding its carrying capacity. At the time, my family lived in a somewhat wooded suburban neighborhood with houses on 2-acre lots. The center of the neighborhood was a small pond, roughly 5 acres in size, surrounded by about a dozen homes. The pond had been stocked originally with bass, providing some decent recreational fishing for children as well as adults. As homes around the pond changed hands, new homeowners started removing the woodland portions of their properties and converting those areas into lawns that ran right up to the water's edge. The pond and its associated lawns soon attracted Canadian geese that started to overwinter, since many families fed the geese leftover pieces of bread and even cracked corn. It wasn't long before the nature of the pond changed visibly from all the nutrients introduced to it via the runoff of lawn fertilizers and the droppings of geese. During the summer, the pond became choked with billowing clumps of filamentous green algae, some as large as cars. One summer, when the bloom was particularly bold, within about a week's time, all the algae dried and floated to the surface, creating a fetid brown mat in which the carcasses of dead bass and sunfish were commonly trapped. The algae had exceeded their carrying capacity, not only to their own demise, but also to that of the fish and possibly other organisms. When the population of algae shot past its carrying capacity, its demand for oxygen during the warm summer nights couldn't be satisfied. The dissolved oxygen levels in the water at night would plummet, degrading the entire pond ecosystem and eventually resulting in the death of both algae and fish. The biosphere and dynamic equilibrium. Limits to growth occur whenever one system is nested within another, like a population of algae nested within a pond. Since the pond has finite resources, in this case dissolved oxygen, once the population digs deep into those resources, negative feedback occurs and results in the population's decline. Although most of the scientific research on limits to growth has been conducted on populations within ecosystems, all of the natural complex systems that we observe on this planet, biological, ecological, geological, meteorological, also function under the overarching law of limits to growth. This even holds true for the largest biological system known, the biosphere. The biosphere is comprised of all the ecosystems that cloak the Earth. Current scientific evidence suggests that living organisms have been on this planet for at least 3.8 billion years, and photosynthetic organisms, those that can convert sunlight into usable energy, have been around for at least the last 3 billion years. Since that time, organisms on the Earth have captured more energy through photosynthesis than they have released as heat through their metabolism or cellular respiration. Photosynthesis is a process where water and carbon dioxide are combined using captured solar energy to build carbohydrates, energy storage molecules such as starch or sugar. In these carbohydrate molecules, energy is stored wherever a hydrogen atom is bonded onto a carbon atom. Although with the production of carbohydrates, oxygen is released as a byproduct of photosynthesis. Cellular respiration is photosynthesis exactly in reverse. Oxygen is used by cells in order to break down carbohydrates and retrieve the energy stored within these molecules. Once used by the organism, the retrieved energy is lost as heat. Along with heat, the other two byproducts of respiration are water and carbon dioxide. So then he has photosynthesis, carbon dioxide plus water plus solar energy leads to carbohydrates plus oxygen. Respiration, oxygen plus carbohydrates, leads to heat energy plus water plus carbon dioxide. If a plant conducts more photosynthesis than respiration, it grows. The growth can be measured as the increased biomass, organic matter, of the plant from the carbohydrates stored from photosynthesis. If photosynthesis and respiration are equal in a plant, growth stops and dynamic equilibrium results. In this state, the solar energy absorbed by the plant is equal to its energy released as heat. Scientific evidence suggests that the early atmosphere of the Earth prior to photosynthetic organisms was devoid of oxygen gas. As photosynthetic life spread across the globe, oxygen started to build up in the atmosphere. Increasing oxygen is synonymous with growth because it means that photosynthesis and the production of biomass is taking place at a higher rate than respiration, a process that consumes oxygen. If both of these processes had occurred at an equal rate since life first established on Earth, today the planet would be devoid not only of an oxygen-rich atmosphere, but also of all living and dead organic matter, since each represents stored biomass energy, which has to result from a historically greater rates of photosynthesis. Atmospheric oxygen reached its current 21% concentration more than 250 million years ago. Since that time, it has been quite stable, signifying that biospheric photosynthesis and respiration have equalized, creating a dynamic equilibrium where the rate of solar energy captured by life on Earth is roughly equal to the rate at which it is released as heat through the metabolism of all its biota. The heat eventually drifts out to space where it is dissipated into the universe. Like reindeer, lemming, and algae, the biosphere honors limits to growth, too. From the window behind my computer, I look out to what used to be a pasture for dairy cows and has now grown into a young white pine woodland. Below the pines, red maple and black birch saplings have started to invade the forest understory. From the older forest behind this pine woodland, I'd guess that in time, after the maple and birch gain dominance, that they will eventually be displaced by eastern hemlock. Although the chances are extremely slight, with protection and luck, this patch of forest may avoid future disturbances such as logging, ice storms, pathogens, or blowdowns, and reach old-growth status with hemlock trees more than 300 years of age. If this happens, the forest will experience more than 400 years of successional change, pasture to pine, to mixed hardwoods, to hemlock, to old-growth forest. And then he has a little sort of side section in a different type, into the forest. Although it is unlikely that the abandoned pasture on my property will reach old-growth status, here in Pisgah, I experienced the real thing. Through the centuries, this forest experienced continuous growth as it accrued ever more biomass. That biomass is now visible in huge, widely spaced hemlocks whose 4-foot diameter trunks rise 60 feet before spreading branches. It is visible in the moss-covered, moldering, downed trunks of trees that lived a long, full life. It is visible in the dark humus of the soil that is filled with unseen creatures. Everywhere I look, I see stored solar energy. It is truly mind-boggling, but everything I see, both living and dead, is mostly composed of just water and carbon dioxide, switched into new forms by sunlight. In this forest, as in any organism or ecosystem, very simple beginnings have brought forth a complex majesty. Photosynthesis has well surpassed all of the biota's respiration over many centuries in this old growth. But today, like yin and yang, these two opposing dynamics are balanced. I can't see the balance. On any given day or month, photosynthesis may outpace respiration or vice versa. However, over a large time frame, such as a decade, all of the solar energy absorbed in photosynthesis will be pretty much equal to that released as heat through the cellular respiration of all the forest's organisms. In terms of energy flowing in and out of this system, the old growth is a dynamic equilibrium. It will maintain this state until at some point it experiences a major disturbance, for example, a wind or ice storm. Until then, its hemlocks won't grow bigger than the largest trees I experience today. The number of down trees will remain much the same as young trees replace the old. The humus layer won't grow thicker. Each year, as hemlock needles and leaves of beech and maple fall to the forest floor, an equal amount of organic material in the soil will be broken down to carbon dioxide, water, and heat to be released from the forest. Like a teenager entering adulthood, growth has stopped for this hemlock forest. This is not just true for forests. All ecosystems eventually reach a dynamic equilibrium where the energy entering the system is equal to the energy being released as heat. Dynamic equilibrium of other natural systems. Although we have no memory of it, each of us was once a single microscopic cell. This is certainly astounding to contemplate. As we developed from single cell to fetus to newborn to adult, we took in more energy than we released through respiration. As a result, we stored that energy in our increasing growth as that one cell grew into more than 30 trillion. 30 trillion is a number that's hard to comprehend, so an analogy may help. Imagine a beach backed by dunes. Between the dunes and where the ocean's waves break at high tide is a distance of 100 feet. And the depth of the dry sand where the beach abuts the dunes is 3 feet. So the average depth of dry sand on this beach is 1.5 feet. You walk onto the beach and scoop up a large handful of sand. This equals about 100,000 grains. How much of this beach is required to hold 30 trillion grains of dry sand? To get this many grains of sand, we would need a length of beach equal to almost a mile. All those grains of sand on that mile length of beach are equivalent to the number of cells in your body. When we reach adulthood, we stop increasing the number and size of the cells in our bodies. The only exceptions are fat and muscle cells that can increase in size in an adult. Yet for an adult with a healthy lifestyle, growth stops, and like an old-growth forest, the body reaches a dynamic equilibrium in which the number of calories assimilated from food on a daily basis equals the number released through body heat. Like us, all other organisms honor limits to growth at adulthood. This is a trait that has been selected by nature. Any individual that continues to grow and needed ever-increasing food resources after it reached adulthood would have more and more difficulty meeting its energy needs compared to individuals who stopped growing. Limits to growth is an inherent law that governs all organisms, populations, ecosystems, and even the biosphere, systems that are all nested one within another. Limits to growth is an inherent law that governs all organisms, populations, ecosystems, and even the biosphere, systems that are all nested one within the other. But not only do biological systems honor this law, it operates in the Earth's physical systems too. On September 4th, 1938, an upper air depression formed in the south-central region of the Sahara Desert. Little could anyone have known that in 17 days, this meteorological phenomenon far off in Africa would generate the most powerful hurricane to strike New England in its recorded history, the Great Hurricane of '38. As the storm migrated over the Middle Atlantic, it absorbed energy from the ocean's warm waters. It used this energy, like biological entities, to grow and to become more organized. By September 16th, located to the northeast of Puerto Rico, the tropical depression had grown and become energized enough to reach hurricane status. For the next few days, it moved northward, strengthening to become a strong Category 3 hurricane. But it then stabilized on the evening of September 20th. This storm, like all hurricanes and typhoons, eventually reached a state where it didn't become more powerful. Nested in the global meteorological system, these cyclones honor limits to growth since the energy resources that support them are finite. The same is true for glaciers, mountains, mountain ranges, and any complex physical system that exhibits growth. All eventually reach a state of dynamic equilibrium where growth stops. In fact, try to think of a single example of a biological or physical system that experiences ever-increasing growth. Neoclassical economic orthodoxy and growth. This then raises the question, if everything that we observe in the world around us honors limits to growth as a means to sustain itself, why is the underlying foundation for our current paradigm of progress ever-increasing growth? The answer lies in a body of economic theory that not only has no grounding in it, but is actually divorced from the scientific laws that govern the universe. In a very real sense, our reigning neoclassical economic orthodoxy has been developed in an artificial world where resources are infinite and waste, including garbage, pollution, toxins, and environmental degradation, don't exist, and where our socioeconomic system functions in a void rather than being nested within the biosphere. Classical economic theory was developed in the 18th century, prior to the Industrial Revolution. At that time, resources seemed infinite, and the kinds of waste generated by industrialization had not yet been experienced. Adam Smith's influential work, The Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776, a good 2 decades before the onset of industrial culture. Since resources appeared unlimited and industrial waste was non-existent, it is understandable that classical economic theory was solely focused on human commerce, wealth, and market dynamics, excluding any interface with the natural world. Economics was birthed in a void. To this day, classical theory reigns, even though there are a large number of economists who attack the governing economic theory as being flawed. The first authoritative voice to state that our current economic orthodoxy was seriously flawed, since it didn't incorporate critical scientific laws, was Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen in his 1971 book, The Entropy Law and the Economic Process. Georgescu-Roegen does a masterful job of pointing out how reigning economic theory doesn't incorporate the Second Law of Thermodynamics and the law's associated implications for ever-expanding energy use. This work was followed in 1972 by the powerful book The Limits to Growth by Donella Meadows and Associates, all accomplished systems scientists. In this book, they pointed out how our economic system is not sustainable and would run itself into serious consequences in the 21st century. In Steady-State Economics, published in 1977, Herman Daly builds on the work of Georgescu-Roegen and points out the inherent flaws in an economic theory based on continual growth. In this book, Daly develops an alternative economic system that operates as a dynamic equilibrium. More recently, William Miernick in The Illusions of Conventional Economics and Steve Dean in Debunking Economics, the Naked Emperor of the Social Sciences, criticize reigning current economic theory as being scientifically unfounded. Kenneth Boulding, former president of the American Economic Association, once stated, quote, "Only madmen and economists believe in perpetual exponential growth," unquote. Yet these voices are rarely heard in our current political climate and are certainly excluded from the development of economic policy at both the national and global level. As Michael Dowd's been saying lately, religion has been asleep at the wheel. The governing concept on which our current economic paradigm of continuous growth is based is the principle of unlimited substitutability. This economic principle states that resources are, figuratively speaking, unlimited because as we exhaust one resource, we will replace it with another, so growth will never cease. We can continue to do this as long as we develop new technologies and increased access to new energy sources. It is precisely these new technologies and increased energy usage that need to be examined more fully, since they create a nexus between economic theory and scientific law. Although orthodox practitioners like to claim that their economic theories are scientific, no amount of mathematical models or statistical equations can label something as science if it intentionally ignores foundational scientific laws such as limits to growth or the Second Law of Thermodynamics. But before we get to the Second Law of Thermodynamics and its relationship to energy consumption, we should take a closer look at technology, the other half of the questionable foundation upon which the principle of unlimited substitutability rests. The cost of technology. To an orthodox neoclassical economist, technology is a free ride where we can get something, increased access to resources, for nothing. Technology offers only benefits: cheaper energy, greater food production, greater longevity, faster travel, expanded communication networks. Yet technology is not benign. All new technologies have some cost. The negative cost of technologies are probably best described in Chapter 9 of Barry Commoner's classic, The Closing Circle. In this chapter, titled The Technological Flaw, Commoner examines the rise of pollution in the United States during the 25-year period from 1946 to 1971. During that quarter of a century, the U.S. population increased 42%. The gross national product rose 126%, and consumption of food, clothing, and shelter increased by 40 to 50%, directly linked to the increase in population. Yet these levels of growth alone could not explain the 200 to 2,000% increases in pollution. The difference was largely due to new technologies that brought about the replacement of pre-World War II materials with new synthetic ones. Just a few of the product changes Americans witnessed during those 25 years were organic fertilizers being replaced with inorganic fertilizers, soaps being replaced with synthetic detergents, glass, metal, and rubber being replaced with plastics, and not to mention the use of a whole new host of synthetic pesticides. All of these new products were derived from petroleum and demanded much higher energy consumption in their production, creating markedly increased rates of air pollution. But that was only part of the problem. The increased use of chlorine gives the fuller picture. During this period, chlorine became an important chemical product. It was needed in the production of many plastics, such as PVC, polyvinyl chloride, and it was utilized in the manufacture of detergents. Since mercury was necessary in the production of chlorine at the time, its use solely for this purpose increased 3,930% between 1946 and 1971. This statistic doesn't include the other dramatic jumps in mercury usage, such as the 3,120% increase in the production of paints. With the production of these new synthetic materials, mercury pollution dramatically increased. Today, there is so much mercury in our environment that a joint advisory from the Food and Drug Administration and Environmental Protection Agency suggests that pregnant women and young children refrain from eating certain species of large fish, such as swordfish and certain species of tuna, and eat no more than 2 servings of any fish in a week, no matter whether it was caught in a river, stream, lake, pond, or even the ocean. This is how ubiquitous mercury pollution has become. There were also serious pollution costs following the use of these new synthetics. Many of the detergents and new plastics were not biodegradable since they were composed of new synthetic molecules that no organisms had the means to break down. The only way to get rid of the plastic was to bury it or burn it. Because of the presence of chlorine, burning produced a new toxic substance, dioxin. This was just one example of the negative impacts that resulted from a new technology that allowed us to substitute new materials for old ones. And this example shows that the concept of unlimited substitutability has definite drawbacks. Due to new technologies in medicine, food production, and energy utilization, the global population of humans soared during the past century from 1.5 billion in 1900 to more than 6 billion in 2000 and now over 7 billion. Along with this population growth came ever-increasing per capita rates of resource and energy consumption, particularly in developed nations. During the decade between 1991 and 2001, Americans increased their collective consumption by 57%. Combined, these two trends have pushed humans beyond the carrying capacity of the biosphere. To reiterate, carrying capacity is the maximal population size that can be supported without degrading a population's ecosystem. However, for humans, the concept of carrying capacity needs to be adjusted to account for differing cultures that influence use of resources and patterns of consumption. Not all human populations have the same carrying capacity. Yet our ultimate ecosystem is the biosphere, and collectively, as a global population, we have exceeded its carrying capacity. All the global environmental problems that we are experiencing today, pollution in all its various forms, extinction of species, depleted fisheries, dwindling supplies of fresh water, deforestation, global climate change, all of them are examples of a degraded biospheric system. How much further can we go with continuous growth before the negative feedback from these environmental problems has dramatic, visible global consequences? There's not a clear answer to this question, but I think it's very unlikely that we will be able to maintain in the 21st century the rates of growth of global resource consumption witnessed during the last century. The exponential growth rates of consumption will eventually generate such a scale of negative feedback from the global system that growth will be halted. Every example that we have of systems that can sustain themselves and prosper is based on limits to growth. Let me repeat that. Every example that we have of systems that can sustain themselves and prosper is based on limits to growth. At maturity, they all reach a state of dynamic equilibrium. The idea that unlimited economic growth will bring continuous progress has no scientific foundation. In fact, science tells us just the opposite. Unchecked growth generates its own negative feedback. We need to embrace another model of progress that is compatible with scientific law, a model already developed by economist Herman Daly. But to engage in such an economic system will first demand major changes in institutions, both corporate and governmental, and possibly, more importantly, in our own cultural values. Here's a final example of a system that doesn't honor limits to growth, that has touched just about everyone's life: cancer. Cancer is a disease, often environmentally induced, in which the genetic instructions within a cell become altered. In a human body, cells replicate only as needed to replace dying cells. Thus, the number of cells in a body stays pretty much the same throughout adulthood. Because of genetic alterations in cancer cells, these cells don't stop their reproduction when they have reached replacement levels, but continue vigorous, unchecked replication. This results in tumors that grow ever bigger, gobbling up the body's resources and eventually displacing other kinds of important cells. If unchecked, the cancer will eventually impair the entire body's system to such a degree that death will result. Is ever-increasing economic growth and associated resource consumption analogous to a biospheric cancer? Neoclassical economists would say that such an analogy is ridiculous. They would contend that new technologies and access to increased energy will allow us to both grow and fix our environmental problems. The track record of economic growth fixing our environmental problems is not very good to date, as we continue to see an increase in environmental degradation at a global level. More importantly, increased energy consumption smacks head-on into the Second Law of Thermodynamics, a scientific law that proponents of our reigning paradigm of progress never mention.